Local variables and scope. In this video, we will define what local variables are and how to determine their scope. A local variable is a variable that is declared inside of and used only within a method or block of code. Examples include parameters, variables declared inside a method, variables declared inside a for loop, variables declared inside a while loop, and variables declared inside an if statement. For example, consider the following program, where we have two different methods that each have two in parameters with the same names, x and y. Although these parameters have the same name, they are not the same variable. Just like having two students in the same classroom with the same first name doesn't make them the same student. Though these parameters have the same name, they are two entirely different sets of variables. This is because parameters exist only inside the method they are declared in. Or in other words, their scope is the method that they are declared in. Thus, the x and y variables that you see inside the add method are not the same x and y variables that you see inside the subtract method. Similarly, suppose I create a method named add2 that receives no parameters but simply returns x plus y. This line will not compile because it's assuming that the x and y variable that was declared inside the add method can be used inside the add2 method. It cannot. Since it was declared inside the add method, it only exists inside the add method. Thus, the code written for add2 would not compile. Now, suppose I bring back the two original methods, but with one small change. Here inside both methods, I declare a variable named result and return that result. As you can see, both methods have a local variable named result. However, just because they have the same name does not mean they're the same variable. Once again, it is just like having two students with the same first name. That doesn't make them the same person. Variables declared inside of a method exist only inside the method they are declared in. Or in other words, their scope is the method that they were declared in. Thus, although both methods have a local variable named result, those variables are entirely separate. They are not the same. Likewise, if I were to create a method named add2 that says, hey, return result, once again, this line would not compile because it assumes that the result variable that was declared inside the add method would still exist inside add2, and it does not. That variable result will only exist inside the add method. Now, consider the following for loop. Inside the for loop header, we declare the loop control variable named I. Then after the for loop, we attempt to print out the loop control variable I. This code would not compile because the loop control variable exists only inside the for loop. Or in other words, its scope is the for loop. For this reason, we can only use it inside of the for loop. Similarly, consider this for loop. Here, inside the for loop, we declare a variable named x. Then we attempt to print it out after the for loop. Once again, this last line would not compile because variables declared inside of a for loop exist only inside the for loop they were declared in. Or in other words, their scope is also just the for loop. Thus, trying to access it outside of the for loop will cause a compiler error. Now, consider the following while loop. In this program, we declare a variable named x inside the while loop, then attempt to print it out outside the while loop. Once again, this line would not compile because variables declared inside of a while loop exist only inside the while loop they were declared in. Or in other words, their scope is only the while loop. Henceforth, trying to access it outside of the while loop will cause a compiler error. Now, consider the following if statement. There are two things to point out about this program. The first point is that we have three strings named s. Once again, although each of these strings have the same name, they are not the same string. They are not the same objects. They are three different objects, each with the same name. This is because variables declared inside of an if block exist only inside that if block. Variables declared inside an else if block exist only inside that else if block. And variables declared inside an else block exist only inside that else block. Therefore, although all three of these strings have the same name, there are three separate string objects. They're not one and the same. The next point we need to make is about how we're attempting to print out the s variable after the if statement. This line of code would not compile because, once again, the three string variables exist only inside the blocks that they were created in. Thus, this would not compile. In summary, variables declared inside of an if block, else if block, or an else block exist only inside of those blocks. Hence, that is the scope for those variables. We cannot access those variables after those blocks are complete. Now, consider this program. Inside this program, we have an instance variable named x, a parameter named x. Then inside the first method, SameNum, we attempt to return x. And then inside the second method named SameNum2, we attempt to return x again. The question that I have for you is, for each method, which x is getting returned? The parameter x or the instance variable x? This is an example of a naming conflict. A naming conflict occurs when two variables have the same name inside of the same scope. When this occurs, the variable with the innermost scope takes precedence, while the variable with the outermost scope no longer exists. So, what do I mean by that? When we're inside the first method, SameNum, the variable with the innermost scope, in that case, is the parameter. Thus, for that first method, the parameter is what's going to get returned. Because once again, the parameter is the variable with the innermost scope. However, when we come to the SameNum2 method, the parameter no longer exists. Because remember, parameters only exist inside the method that they're declared in. So when we step inside SameNum2, the only variable named x that exists is the instance variable. Henceforth, the instance variable is what will get returned in that case. Now, consider this program where we also have a naming conflict. Here we have a variable named x declared outside the for loop and another variable named x declared inside the for loop. We also attempt to print out the variable x inside the for loop and after the for loop. The question I have for you is, in each print statement, which x gets printed out? The outer x variable, the one outside the for loop, or the inner x variable, the one inside the for loop? Well, for the first print statement, recall that we stated that the variable with the innermost scope always takes precedence. So, since inside the for loop we have two variables named x that exist in the scope, we're going to print out the inner x. That's going to be the one that takes precedence. For the second print statement, which is outside of the for loop, in this scope, only one variable named x exists, because remember, any variable declared inside of a for loop is only going to exist inside of that for loop. So when we get to the second print statement, the only variable named x that's in existence at that point is the outer x. Thus, that's the variable that's going to get printed out.